Hello, and welcome to the podcast that tries to answer one simple question. What is this thing called film noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. The great American film composer David Shire is 88 years young today, and to celebrate, I'm joined by John Leman Riley, so that we can look at some of the classic examples of neo-noir music that he wrote in the mid-1970s, including The Taking of Pelham 123, Farewell My Lovely, The Conversation, and All the President's Men. But let's look at the context in which these films first emerged. With the great success of Chinatown, there was, I think, great renewed interest in films that fed into the nostalgia boom and the retro-noir idea. But in actual fact, in the 1970s, there were a number of films that were reimagining and taking those kind of classic noir ideas and tropes and looking at them with the optic of the 1970s. Perhaps the composer most closely associated with 70s noir is David Shire. Now, Shire was someone who started off working in television at Universal in the 1960s, and who, by the beginning of the 70s, had an interesting career that was starting to develop. And I think that one of the first instantly memorable scores that he did, which has this fantastic four-note motif, is The Taking of Pelham 123. I mean, I suppose it's one of those ringtone opening bits of music. It's an amazingly recognizable piece of music, right up there with Cape Fear, maybe. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's an amazing score. Even though it's a jazz funk score, it's much more in the tradition of things like The Killers, where it's a really driving forward. It's not about atmosphere. It's not about sonic quality.
You mean the Miklos Rozsa, yes?
Yeah. It just comes out of the gate at like 100 miles an hour, right between the eyes. It's an amazing, fantastic score. So in the early mid-20th century, Schoenberg came up with the idea of serialism, that you organize the 12 notes of the chromatic scale in a non-tonal way. And this, he said, would guarantee the dominance of German music for the next 100 years. I'm not quite sure he...
Is history on his side, John? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not quite sure he got it exactly right on that one. It fairly quickly splintered into various approaches. So you'll see this score defined as a dodecaphonic score, as a serial score, as a 12-note score. I mean, it is melodically 12-note. The main theme has 12 notes, all of which are different. Now, it's not the first person to do that. Rosenman did it on The Cobweb. Benjamin Frankel did it on The Curse of the Werewolf for a Hammer film. Jerry Goldsmith was experimenting with it in bits of Freud, bits of The Planet of the Apes. So it was an idea, a technique that drifted in and out of film music, which was used not, you might say, canonically. It was used in a kind of quite a loose way, but it changed the sound of music incredibly. I mean, for instance, even Miklos Rozsa used it in The King of Kings. The Satan theme in The King of Kings is actually 12 notes long. And again, it uses all 12 different notes of the chromatic scale. but it's not a dodecaphonic piece or a serial piece. I'd mentioned Blast of Silence from 1961, which has a score by Meyer Kupferman, who was a big jazz clarinetist, which again actually sounds quite similar in some senses, in that it's kind of that slightly unpredictable melody, big bandy kind of sound. So this is the great thing, I think, about the taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. And as you say, it's just immediately recognizable. As soon as you hear that first burst, bam, bada, bam, badam, badam, you know where it's going. And then you get that melody, which is, I won't even attempt to sing it. The weird intervals, jumping all over the place, that unpredictability, that dissonance, all of those things that you associate with classic noir, all of those qualities, modernity, it's urban, it's dissonant, it's unpredictable. That is noir in a lot of ways. And he picks that up on the score amazingly. And he used to, for a lot of his jazzy scores, he used essentially the same kind of band. And again, a band which was full of really classic jazz musicians. Dick Nash was the trombonist. Ronnie Lang played the alto sax, and he was on Taxi Driver. Justin Gordon played tenor sax, and we'll talk about him in another context later on. Shelly Mann on drums. Artie Kane, who scored The Eyes of Laura Mars, he was the pianist on it. So it's all these great, great jazz performers, along with, oddly, Eleanor Slatkin on cello. Leonard Slatkin's dad, who played the cello solo in Deception. I mean, what she felt like being surrounded by all these, New York jazzers, I don't know. And he found this group of jazz musicians, session men, sidesmen, and women, who just gelled fantastically. And it's just the most amazingly exuberant and life-enhancing score. Once you've heard that first main cue, you just can't get it out of your head. And it just, for all the horribleness of the film in a lot of ways, although it's a very comic film as well at the same time, it's very blackly comedic.
Well, very typical of the writer of the screenplay, Peter Stone, who, of course, wrote things like Charade and lots of other things, but was very adept at mixing black and high and low humor.
Exactly. And you just come out of the film doing your best to sing that main theme.
Well, also because you get that great ending, don't you? Which is, again, you don't want to spoil it, but the ending is just this close-up of Mathau looking almost directly into the camera. And because he's just sort of kind of, it's the last moment of the film. And you get this pause, and then you suddenly get, in a lower key, but you get, then the music starts, and you're all right. It's kind of... dun dun dun, at credits. It's just fantastic.
It's a brilliant idea, superbly executed. I mean, it's like for me, it's one of the real peaks of not just noir music, but of film music altogether.
I mean, in actual fact, it's also worth, I think, pointing to the other main bit of music that he wrote for it, because it's one of those films where the amount of music is, in fact, somewhat restricted. It's got only a certain amount of action. It's a lot of dialogue, a lot of very funny dialogue, but also in that kind of sardonic, New York, hard-boiled manner. And it's very much a film of its time. It's about a heist, an unusual heist, because the hostages that are taken are all part of a way to get money from New York City by taking a bunch of New York subway passengers hostage. and then they're going to somehow drive the train away. And of course, they all joke about it. It says, well, where are they going to get to? They're only going to get to the end of the line. What's the point? Yeah. And of course, it's more clever than that. And Mathau, as the investigator, the Transit Authority investigator, figures out that, well, surely that's what they started with. It's how they get away, because they've got a plan to get away. And the music absolutely comes along with that kind of grungy New York feel to it, that hard-boiled edge. But it also has this piece of music that is when they've decided to pay the ransom, and they are counting the money furiously because Robert Shaw, who plays the leader of the, let's call them the bad guys, he gives him literally minutes to get it done and is sort of adamant that he won't give them any extra time. And ultimately Mathau only gets around it by lying, which is kind of great. And so you see all this music with this frenzy of people trying to count the money. They've got to be used bills. They've got to be tied up in a certain way, delivered in a certain way, all within a certain timetable. And they've got to somehow clear the streets, which are full of people, and deliver them to this part of the subway. And so you get this kind of action-y type music, but which is very, very fast. I don't know what the tempo on that is, but it's extremely accelerated. Yeah. And again, it's terrific because on the one hand, it teeters on the edge of the absurd. The timetable they've been given is not achievable, not really. And in fact, they even say that in the film. It says, this could never work. Something's sort of off here. What's going on? How could they possibly expect us? But in the meantime, the music's pushing you in that direction to see if they can possibly make this deadline, because passengers are in fact getting killed. So this is where, although it's very funny, it's also very dark, because people do get killed in this film, and a couple of the people who get killed in very nasty ways too. Let's not go into spoiler territory, but I do love that piece of music as well, which again is very contrapuntal and very dynamic piece of scoring, and it works like a dream.
Get personnel and tell them to get together a list of all motormen discharged for cause during the past 5 to 10 years.
What are you looking for?
Somebody down there knows how to drive a train. You don't pick that up watching Sesame Street. Tell me one, it's at 8.
Mr. Gray, can I have a word with you, please?
But in fact, it's the only other obvious extra bit of music other than what you hear all compressed into that essential kind of 2.5 minute title music, isn't it, really? I think it's the only other substantial piece of score.
It is, yeah. But like you say, all of the music is just so driving and just so, I won't say breathless, but it's just got this incredible propulsive quality. It just picks you up by the scruff of the neck and it drags you along. I've never watched it without the music, and I wonder,
what it would be like,
whether actually it would be a slower film without the music, because it doesn't have that kind of Michael Bay kind of editing or anything.
If you compare it with that remake, it was also made for television with Vincent D'Onofrio in the lead, but that film version that Tony Scott made, which is visually very intriguing, but the exact polar opposite of this film, if you like, which has a very controlled, rather beautifully shot in CinemaScope. And the editing is not especially fast, because again, you've got fast music, but this is about a subway train that stood still. And they're kind of stuck. And then there's a moment when, of course, things do move towards the end. And so then the editing does ramp up a bit. Whereas by the time Scott made that film, and it was kind of the final phase of his career, I hesitate to say overloaded, but visually very heavy, clotted sort of imagery with lots and lots of things happening. And, it suggests a different kind of frenzy, if you will. And at least you look at it and you think, well, you certainly can't mistake one for the other. So they're not just lazily redoing it. They've rethought it. Whether you think it's good or better, I personally don't like it quite as much. I don't think even on its own terms, it doesn't succeed as much. But it's a different approach, and so it's totally legitimate. It's another adaptation of the novel, I think. I can't remember if they, in fact, credit the screenplay for this film or not. But in the meantime, I think that it's sort of fascinating because you're not working against the images, but I agree that I think it gives it its dynamism a lot of the time, because otherwise it's in the dialogue. And again, the dialogue scenes they're very well acted. It's a terrific cast. Even all the subsidiary characters are really great, whether it's Doris Roberts as the wife of the mayor, who is totally sort of jaundiced, and the mayor's aide by Tony Roberts, who is someone we now associate more with Woody Allen's films of the era, and again, who is just mocking the mayor because he just can't make a decision because he's got the flu anyway. All these sorts of things which make it a very exciting and fun film to watch, but in a different sort of way. So I agree with you that the film truly gives it that extra element. Now, if we look at Shire's career at this moment, then there's kind of this 4-year period when he's scoring these important neo-noirs, and tonally they're all extremely different in terms of what kind of films they are, but also musically what kind of approach he's taking. So that chronologically, the next one along is almost the exact opposite. It's The Conversation, written and directed by Francis Coppola, released in 1974, starring Gene Hackman. And it has, I think, less than 20 minutes of music, and it's all played just on the piano. There's although on the soundtrack there are arrangements for a kind of jazz band which are bigger and perfectly fun to listen to, they will not be found in the film itself. What they do in the film is, and this is courtesy of Walter Murch, is that they modify the sound so that it's fed through a number of electronic filters which both distort and augment that soundtrack, but literally the piano is the only musical instrument. I think it's amazing score. It's again one of those things where you hear the first bar and you know immediately kind of where you are. Whereas the other film was this kind of dynamic, propulsive, urban piece of music, and that was New York City. This is about San Francisco, kind of a foggy, Kafkaesque vision of Northern California, and one that is really about paranoia and loneliness and surveillance. Here we have Shire as this kind of new breed of composers who are coming in, and who, a bit like Michael Small, is adapting their style to whichever film it is in fact they're faced with. So you don't immediately say, oh, that's by this person. I think it's a wonderful piece of music. I don't know what you think about it. I don't know what the obvious influences on it are. It seems to me one of Shire's finest.
I think the idea for the electronic interventions, which are actually quite subtle in some ways, probably was as much Shire as Walter Murch. Coppola had been dragged off to start prepping
second Godfather film.
Yeah, and so basically all of the post was done by Murch. You know, obviously sent over what he was doing to Coppola, and Coppola signed it off, but he wasn't in the room at the time. This is all Walter Murch and, I assume, David Shire. So I was thinking about it in terms of films like Blow Up and De Palma's Blowout, which kind of sit on either side of it. Blow Up from 1966, Blowout from 1981. All films which are about having a fragment of understanding of the world and trying to extrapolate a complete understanding from that. You only have some bits of evidence. So in Blow Up, it's a rather distant photograph, which somehow he manages to blow up to about 20 foot square.
But the irony being, yes, that the more he blows it up, the less he sees. Yes.
And similarly with Blowout, which is a kind of a sonic counterpart to Blow Up. And I think in a way, the conversation is the same thing. Harry Cole, Gene Hackman, is this uber fantastic sound recordist who works for shadowy organizations, basically listening in on conversations in situations which have defeated everybody. And it starts with him somehow managing to record fragments of a conversation from two people in the middle of a public square. So there's nowhere to put a microphone. There's no kind of boom is going to pick it up. How does he do this?
Harry Cole is an expert. The best there is.
Let me tell you something about Harry Cole. The best, bar none. I'll drink to that.
Best what?
The best bugger on the West Coast.
What about me?
He can bug anybody, anytime, anywhere.
Nobody knows how you did it, though, Harry. Caused a hell of a scandal, too.
Look, do you see him? The man with the hearing aid, like Charles. He's been following us all
They're
over.
not people to him, just voices.
3 people were murdered, that's all.
He doesn't know them, and they don't know him.
Had nothing to do with me. I mean, I just turned in the tapes.
Bless me, Father, for I've sinned. I've been involved in some work that I think will be used to hurt these 2 young people. No way responsible. I'm not responsible.
You're not supposed to feel anything about it. You're just supposed to do it.
Be careful, Harry. You're just supposed to listen. Not look, not feel, not care.
And of course, the assignment is so difficult that he doesn't pick up the whole of the conversation, and he becomes obsessed with this fragment of the conversation that he hears and the kind of blurry bits that he kind of half records, and somehow trying to make sense of the world out of that. That treatment of the piano, again, is a brilliant counterpart. It's like, well, it's a piano, but it's not quite a piano, in the same way that it's a conversation, but it's not quite a conversation. We should actually also mention the saxophone, because Harry
Yes. He has his own saxophone, yes.
is playing the saxophone, accompanying his jazz records with his own improvisations, which are actually Justin Gordon, which again is part of Shire's regular crew of musicians. And again, and we'll talk about the saxophone in a few minutes, I'm sure. Normally it's a kind of it's an erotic instrument, but here it's just this horribly lonely, isolated sound. And again, the fact that he's playing along to these records, he's part of the performance, but he's not part of the performance, because the performance is on the record and he's simultaneously in it and out of it, which again just emphasizes his loneliness and his isolation. As you say, there isn't very much music in it. Again, it's a very talky score. A lot of these 1970s films were very, very word heavy. It doesn't leave a lot of space for music. But this is an instance where I don't think there's even a call for much more music. It's not that he's slipping the music in wherever he can. It's just, it's not a film that demands a lot of music. Music is can be a humanizing factor. And this is a film where they have to be careful not to humanize things too much.
Although I think I think that piano, that sort of solitary, lonely piano is identified entirely with Harry Cole, with Gene Hackman's character. Yeah. And I think it's like the sound in his head, isn't it, really? You're it's when you see him, because there's no title music, the opening sequence in Union Square, it's the sound, they're trying to capture the sound of the eponymous conversation. And we probably point out, if you haven't seen it, go out, see it, come back and listen to the rest of the conversation, but we're not going to give things away. But they famously, they cheat ever so slightly, because
ever so slightly,
because he misunderstands what he hears. But when we hear it again to emphasize what he's misunderstood, they have in fact re-recorded it so that it's not the intonation, it's not what he first heard. But in a way that psychologically makes complete sense and it gives it great cinematic impact. So we only hear that music mostly that it's kind of like mood music for an individual. So that there's a shot where he's just sitting on the bus and you hear just this great sort of tinkly piano music by David Shire to accompany Gene Hackman on the bus. And in fact, at the end of the film, there is no end title music by David Shire. There is music heard or an instrument being played, but it's not really musical. It's anguish. It's a kind of scream from the soul. We'll leave it at that, I think. But it's one of those great 1970s films. I think it could be Coppola's finest film anyway. And if it isn't, my God, what a great 1974 he had. You know, that and Godfather Part 2. Bloody hell. You know, it's an incredible achievement. And then, and the next one was this little thing called Apocalypse Now. Brilliant stuff. Brilliant stuff. So we've gone from New York to San Francisco, and now we're going to go to LA. And it's LA in the 1940s, and it's what was in fact the third adaptation of Farewell My Lovely, the second Philip Marlowe novel by Raymond Chandler. Previously been adapted as Murder My Sweet with Dick Powell, and before that it had been turned into a film starring George Sanders as the Falcon, which is actually a reasonably close adaptation in its own terms and perfectly entertaining, but nonetheless, let's stick with the Marlowe versions.
One interesting point is that The Falcon Takes Over and Murder My Sweet, although Beleynikov was credited as the composer, Misha Beleynikov, on the Falcon Takes Over, Roy Webb did contribute some music. And then, of course, he wrote the entire score for Murder My Sweet. So one of those rare instances where two films on the same subject are actually scored by the same composer.
Yeah, but Beleynikov isn't credited on Murder My Sweet, right? It's always...
No, on The Falcon Takes Over.
On Falcon Takes Over, yeah. I mean, again, they're also made about 18 months apart or something? I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? The studio just repurposing the material because they've got it. And they turn it into this fantastic, one of the earliest examples, in fact, of film noir. And here now comes this remake, starring Robert Mitchum, who was starring in films RKO at the time, but who is here in his late 50s. So the tone is going to be slightly different. There's this kind of world-weary quality to it, certainly from the way he performs the role. You've got Charlotte Rampling, the femme fatale, and she is sort of made up to look a bit like Lauren Bacall from The Big Sleep and To Have and Have Not. And so it's a film that is part of that nostalgia boom of the 1970s. At the same time, it has some interesting sort of similarities with Chinatown, which came out the year before. It shares, for instance, the same cinematographer. But whereas Chinatown, which was shot by John Alonzo, was made in anamorphic widescreen and used a lot of orange lenses to give it that kind of sun-kissed feel. Now Alonso is using Fujifilm stock to give it a softer look, but also a kind of grungier look. It's not shot in anamorphic, it's shot in regular widescreen, so the compositions are tighter and everything feels smaller. It's told in the first person, so it's told in flashback. Mitchum narrates. He gets to throw off a number of great Chandler lines, but also a number of great ones written by David Selleck Goodman. And it's a mostly fairly faithful adaptation. I know that you are not necessarily the world's biggest fan of it. I've always loved it. I used to rent it in the 1980s on Super 8mm. And we used to watch it all together, the whole family. I had a Super 8mm camera, and I had a Super 8mm projector, and I had a screen. And in fact, I have a feeling you may have seen some films on that screen when I got a digital projector decades later. And it looked great. It looked absolutely fantastic on Super 8, actually. It was one of those films that was a joy to watch. One of the absolute best things about it is, however, the score by David Shire, which is a full orchestral score this time. So he's got a proper band there. It's got a sort of, I think, an augmented sort of jazz ensemble type feel to it. It's got nice big strings. It's got Dick Nash and Ronnie Lang. Although Ronnie Lang only plays the sax in the title music. And, of course, there's a reason for that. But over to you, John.
For whatever reason, Shire didn't use a single saxophonist. So every solo in the film actually is a different saxophonist because he has like tenor, alto, and soprano saxes who step up to the mic in turn. Don Menza plays the soprano, and Justin Gordon again plays the tenor. You know, again, like I was saying, it's this tight group of his regular people.
Mitchum, the last of the tough guys, meets Rampling, the hottest of the new broads, in Raymond Chandler's sizzling murder classic, Farewell, My Lovely.
Why don't you come over here and sit beside me?
You know, I've been thinking about that for some time. Ever since you first crossed your legs, to be exact.
These damn things are always up around your neck. Your name's Phil, isn't it?
Philip, what's yours?
Helen, kiss me.
Philip Marlowe, the most famous private eye of them all, is up to his eyeballs in murder. And he's everybody's favorite target.
Look, this is a gun. When you got a gun in your hand, people are supposed to do what you tell them to do. What I need is another drink. I need a lot of life insurance. I need a home in the country. I need a vacation. I've got a hat, a coat, and a gun. That's it.
I think occasionally, I find the voiceover a bit over-explicative. You know, it kind of explains things, and it's like, yeah, I can see that. You don't have to tell me what's happening. But I kind of like it as an exercise in retro noir. It's actually set very specifically in late June, 1941. And the newspaper seller says, hey, what do you think about this? You know, Hitler's invaded Russia, 22nd of June, 1941.
But they're really talking about the baseball season, aren't they? Yes.
But yeah, and that's the other thing, this really weird obsession that he has with Babe Ruth. John DiMaggio.
John DiMaggio.
Seems very strange. But the music, which is what we're here to talk about, there's some of that fantastic, you know, when you play a double bass and you do pizzicato, but you pull the string away from the fretboard so that it slaps onto the back, so you get a note, but you also get this like crack of the string hitting the fretboard. You get that. You get weird dissonant bits. Of course, there's a scene where he is drugged, but for that one, you know, we talked about the drugging scene in the Maltese Falcon and how that's driven mostly by music. Here, it's driven mostly by just overlapping manic laughter with some weird kind of bass, very, very deep bass notes, either double bass or a contrabassoon or something like that. One of the things that is really characteristic of the film is that a lot of it is harmonically very cramped. He just alternates between two chords, and it's got a kind of a lazy, kind of sleepy quality, which, of course, you know, people always talked about Mitchum's sleepy eyes and how his performance style was was to be barely awake. And so the music kind of reflects that. But it's also a kind of a sense of trap. You can't get out of these two chords. You're just stuck between these alternating two or maybe three chords, which he then kind of has much more elaborate and much freer solos on top of, the sax solos particularly. So again, it's one of the things I think Shire is great at is identifying what the film is about and finding a musical parallel for that. So whether it's the unsettling kind of sound quality of the conversation, or like I say, this trapped, I'm stuck in these three chords kind of feeling of Farewell My Lovely. That's, I think, one of the great things that he always nails, certainly at this period. I mean, all of the films that we talk about here, he understands the film absolutely and absolutely finds a sonic musical equivalent.
It's a lovely sound. He recreates a couple of big band songs that in fact he had orchestrated by Jack Hayes, who of course was an old pro, and he had him do that a bit like James Horner would have that done for Cocoon, for instance, about a decade later or so. It's a lovely melody. In fact, what's interesting about the opening title music, which is then becomes also the end title music, Shire had to go back and ultimately not just re-record it, but he ended up having to pay for it himself, because the way he'd originally done it in the studio session, they said to him afterwards, "We love it, but it does sound a bit like a James Bond movie," which obviously John Barry is someone who had that big band sound. But it sounds like, therefore, he'd gone for a bigger, noisier sound, in the arrangement. But the trouble is they told him that and then told him, yeah, but the budget's spent, so that's it. And so ultimately Shire, I think he says he never regretted it, but he agreed with them. To his frustration, he suddenly thought, you're right. I need to rearrange this and re-record it. So out of his own pocket, he got a new session done and called in Ronnie Lang to do it on the alto sax. And it is this, it's got this wonderful piano intro, and then with this kind of insistent kind of little introductory theme, which just goes up and down and reverses itself. And then we get this sort of luscious sax, and it's this gorgeous theme, and I think it's one of the parts of the film that survived. I think that the soundtrack, I think, was very successful, and in fact it's one of those films where Shire tended to do somewhat. He's done films with very big scores. He would do big films like 2010 and Return to Oz, which of course was directed by Walter Murch. But so he's quite capable of doing that. But a lot of his scores, especially from the ones that we're talking about here, tend to be quite minimal. So for the album, in fact, he kind of stitched together smaller cues to create a more satisfying 3, 4, 5 minute musical extracts. And it's so in fact when they re-released it, when Film Score Monthly did their CD of it, which is very much a prized possession of mine on my shelves, rather than just do the session recordings, which is what they would normally always do, they in fact opted to recreate the album versions by using the multi-track, but re-edit them together so that you've got the same clusters, as it were, so that it works as an album, because it's a beautiful album, and I think it sounds really great. I mean, I think that the whole score is probably less than 40 minutes, but it's I think gorgeous to listen to, and completely stands up on its own as well, just as music.
Yeah, like as we were talking about Odds Against Tomorrow, and how John Lewis regarded it as a composition in itself. Shire very much, I think, saw that opportunity to make something different, and so the LP as you say, it's not just sitting down and listening to the main title and then the first cue and then the second cue and then the third cue, It's not that at all. Again, he rethinks the music as a different whole.
So we move from this undeniable exercise in nostalgia, and I think a successful one. You may have a few doubts, but I love it. To what was a very topical story and one that was very much part of the new Hollywood. This was All the President's Men. So we've gone from New York to San Francisco to Los Angeles, and now we're in Washington.
There's been a break-in at Democratic headquarters, and they were bugging the place. Woodward, Bernstein, you're both on the story now. Don't get up.
Redford.
I'm Bob Woodward of the Washington Post. Mr. Markham, are you here in connection with the Watergate burglary?
I'm not here.
Hoffman.
Hi, this is Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, and I was just wondering if you can remember...
All the President's Men. The story of the two young reporters who cracked the Watergate conspiracy.
White House.
Howard Hunt, please.
He might be in Mr. Colson's office.
Who's Charles Colson? Did you know, Howard Hunt?
Well, the White House said he was doing some investigative work.
What do you say?
They stumbled into leads.
Certainly it comes as no surprise to you that Howard was with the CIA.
No surprise at all.
They tripped over clues.
We'd like to see all the material requested by the White House.
All White House transactions are confidential.
This whole thing is a cover-up. It's right on our nose.
And piece by piece, they solve the greatest detective story in American history.
This is the story about Woodward and Bernstein breaking the story about the Watergate break-in that ultimately led to Richard Nixon's resignation. And this is another film with a terrific score that, a bit like The Conversation, is certainly a film about paranoia, but not in that truly existential, dreading sort of arena that we associate with that film. Here, instead, this is a bit more of a political thriller, except that it's a real-life one. And I think it's the ultimate conspiracy movie in the sense that while there will be conspiracy movies like, say, Manchurian Candidate or The Parallax View, which had come out a couple of years before this one, which are brilliant. And I mentioned Parallax View because it's the same director as All the President's Men, Alan J. Pakula. But at the same time, they're quite bleak in their outlook. This is a great conspiracy movie, even though you know exactly what the ending's going to be, because ultimately justice wins out, and it's so rare. Most conspiracy movies are, of course, either you get a happy ending and you don't believe it. Otherwise, they're, of course, despairing, sad films about how you lose because the conspiracy will always win. The classic example of which is Blowout, which has an ending that still divides people, but I think it's a fantastic ending. Journalism, The Fourth Estate, we get this idea that, I mean, again, one of the amazing things about Watergate, of course, is that it seems quite small potatoes. I mean, we're recording this and we don't know yet who's going to win the American elections. We know who we want to win, and we're really scared about what might happen. I remain positive. Small note from Sergio here. We did record this back in September of 2024, and so, yeah, we didn't know who was going to win the election. Oh, happy days. But this is a film in which it was about the fact that they broke in and sold, Republicans broke in and sold some stuff from the Democrats. And in fact, turns out they did it not once but twice. But they got caught the second time because they went there their first time and they screwed it up. So they go back and do it again and then get caught. And it's about the cover-up of that leads to indictments and so on and so forth. And you're thinking, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's such a small thing. If you consider the endless lying and chicanery and, you know, people attacking the Capitol and these sorts of things, how far the world has come in 50 years in such a bad way.
Yeah, you almost look back with fondness on the days when, you know, merely breaking into your opponent's office and stealing
was enough for you to have to resign. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, not that he did it right away. This is another film where I think he has brilliantly judged the soundscape of the film and the way that it works within this fairly paranoid thriller, justifiably paranoid thriller. Because in fact, I think it's a good half hour before there's any music in the film at all, as I recall.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things, again, talking about PELHAM, taking PELHAM 1, 2, 3, that music, the way that comes in, it tells you what the pace of the film will be. And here, like you say, hey, there's no music for quite a long time. And then when it comes in, if you haven't already gathered that it's a slow burn movie, the music kind of tells you that. It's this kind of murky, low woodwind kind of wandering around. And then again, he finds this brilliant musical gesture to tell you what the film is about. And it's basically just a very simple rising arpeggio, which he repeats. And there's a kind of obsessive quality about it. But then as it goes on, he reorders the notes. So it's not just a rising arpeggio. It goes maybe 1, 3, 4, 2, 1, 4, 2, 3. It makes it a bit like a Rubik cube. You're looking at this thing from all kinds of different angles. So in a sense, he's investigating that arpeggio just as, the newspaper is investigating the break-in. Gestural parallel again of what the film is about. It's a film which is again very talky because it's lots of people, knocking on doors and saying, do you know, can I ask you, can I come in? When did you do this? When did this happen? Who is this? It's just endless questions. And that gesture just, for me, really embodies what the film is about. And it's one of the great things I think that Shire does is, as I say, he just knows what the film is and he finds a way to do it musically.
Also, it's just extraordinary, isn't it? There's a quartet of films that he's involved with at just the right time. And he really interprets them in their own very special ways and gives you something distinctive and different and really recognizable every single time, which is an amazing achievement. And of course then capped decades later when he gets asked to come and score Zodiac for David Fincher, which sort of partly recreates that kind of 60s and 70s era. And so it's kind of nice that he kind of topped it off, as it were, at the end of the kind of that period in this sort of interesting way. Shire's had a very, very, very varied career. Of course, at the time that he was doing Conversation, he was Coppola's brother-in-law. He was married to Talia Shire, who was, of course, Talia Coppola. Apparently, he tells the story that when he'd written the score for Farewell, My Lovely, he ended up having this wild crush on Charlotte Rampling in the film. And so that, a bit like David Raksin sort of saying that he was inspired to write the theme for Laura because he got this Dear John letter. Here, instead, he was sort of wrote this kind of rhapsodic theme because he thought she was just fantastic. And apparently he went on to David Raksin's radio show and he mentioned that and got a phone call from Didi Khan, who everybody knows from playing Frenchie in Grease and Grease 2. And she was sort of pretending to be Charlotte Rampling for a second, just to have him on, but really to say, look, let's have a date. And they got married, and they've been married ever since. So it's kind of like, you know what? It's kind of Farewell, My Lovely indirectly helped him get married. And how brilliant is that? You don't expect that in a film noir. So, you do get some happy endings and things do pay off. But I think that's a great way to finish our look at that period of film noir, film scoring, John. So thanks so much for talking us through it. Can't wait for us to tackle the 80s when we have to deal with synthesizer noir.
Yes, yeah. No, I mean, it's been great. I mean, it's fantastic impetus to dig out these films and these scores and to watch them again and listen to them again and have a think in a more concentrated and hopefully focused way. And so, yeah, I'm digging out the Korg later.
Until then, John, talk to you soon, mate. Thanks very much.
Okay, that's brilliant.
Take care. You. Bye. I'm going to tell you something. That's exactly what you said at the end of the previous podcast.
I see.
You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.